So our first session today is titled Objects in Motion, and we have three wonderful speakers, Maria Nugent, Stephen Gilchrist and Mark DeVitis. Maria Nugent is going to kick us off, and her presentation is looking at Shellwork slippers in Buckingham Palace. Maria is a senior fellow in the Australian Centre for Indigenous History at the School of History at ANU. Her work straddles academic and public forms of history with a particular focus given to analysing past and present modes of telling history and making memory in cultural heritage, community and museum contexts, and of course through art, oration, objects, performance, petitioning and diplomacy, and film and television. So please join me in welcoming Maria.
Thanks very much. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the country on which we're speaking today, and also to thank Priya and Molly and Georgina for the invitation to present at what looks like a really wonderful 2 days of papers. So I'll start with an object which I've only recently become aware of, and some of my responses to it are quite new, and so this is really very much a work in progress, and I'll appreciate your comments about it. So a pair of shell-worked slippers of the kind that are made at La Perouse and coastal New South Wales was recently found in a cupboard in a corridor of Buckingham Palace in London. And the details and images have been added to the online database of the Royal Collection Trust. The Collection Trust has only sort of gone online since 2012. Now, more recently, the little object has featured in a spread of the Australian Women's Weekly, in which, this is just in August this year, in which Prince Charles and Camilla opened the doors to Clarence House to the weekly's readers. And you'll see that they had a whole pile of objects to show the journalist, including the little pair of shell shoes recently found. I'm going to come back to this article at the end of this paper. Now, Gay Sculthorpe, curator at the British Museum, and I became aware of the shell shoes through work that we've been doing on an ARC-funded project called the Relational Museum and its Objects, which among other things has involved looking for and interpreting Indigenous Australian objects in British collections, both small and large, regional and metropolitan. And the Relational Museum project developed out of the Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilisation exhibition at the British Museum and the Encounters exhibition at the National Museum of Australia, held across 2015 and 2016. And I think a number of people in the room would be aware of it and even involved in it. So earlier this year, we had the privilege of seeing the shell shoes. At Buckingham Palace, we met with Rachel Peat, the keen-eyed curator who'd spotted the sweet little shell-encrusted and faded velvet baby shoes among myriad items in a nondescript display cupboard in some sort of far reaches of Buckingham Palace. Pete is assistant curator of non-European works of art in the Royal Collection, which amounts to something like 13,000 objects spread across 13 current and former royal residences. And so I think it's impressive and also very pleasing that she recognised the miniature shoes as, and I'll say, as an Australian object, whatever that might be, and also recognised them as significant, precious and valuable. Yet perhaps we should not be surprised that the shell shoes were seen for what they are. Given the quite considerable scholarly and curatorial attention the practice has received in recent times, we might well hope that a curator today was more likely than her predecessors to recognise what is otherwise, I think, an easy to overlook object among what is really the overwhelming mass of art and objects filling the palace. Perhaps it is its quotidian and marginal quality, made humbly from shells, fabric and cardboard, and glue and grit, that helped it to stand out and to capture a busy curator's attention. So awareness of, knowledge about and appreciation of Aboriginal women's shell work has steadily grown in Australia and overseas since at least the 1980s, I think, with the foundational work of Peter Mackenzie and Anne Stephen at the Powerhouse Museum, and later curator Tess Ellis, who I think has done much to champion it, and particularly to champion it as a contemporary art practice. Many people, including a number in this room, have further contributed through research, publication, exhibition, collection, commissioning, documentary making, not to mention, of course, the enduring efforts of shell artists themselves, like Esma Timbry and the late Lola Ryan, which keeps contemporary forms of shell work in the public eye and in public collections. But still, it's quite hard to find early 20th century examples of it, even though that was a period really, to some extent, of its heyday. So reflecting this kind of accumulated knowledge, the online record for the shell slippers at Buckingham Palace gives, I think, a good version of the now conventional and agreed account, which we have been sort of contributing to, Priya, as much as me and others. It places the slippers in a long history of craft production and Aboriginal women's savvy engagement with various markets, including tourist, missionary and contemporary museum and galleries, and it emphasises it, I think, really in terms of commodity and craft object. Yet the recent identification of this pair in the Royal Collection, I think, really now provides some scope to expand on that story which we have been telling. Both to explore some of its other meanings and lives and the routes by which it travelled out from Aboriginal communities, probably La Perouse, into London and into the royal family's possession. And to better understand the ways in which women's work, Aboriginal women's work, was taken up, I think, by non-Indigenous women in very contradictory and fraught ways, taken up for their own political, aesthetic and nation-making projects. So in this paper, I just want to really sketch this out. I want to indicate some of the ways in which I think we can understand shell work as one means to examine and reveal quite a bit about relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous women in the early part of the 20th century. And to take up the invitation that Priya gave us about the work that it does in a kind of cross-cultural context as a mediating object in the spaces, I think, of cross-cultural interaction, which don't obviously necessarily involve Indigenous and non-Indigenous women coming together, but in which objects like shell work pass between them. And I'm sort of mainly interested in what sort of work of remembering and forgetting that shell work does, both then and now. So of course we know that Aboriginal women's shell work was already a product of cross-cultural interactions. But the question here now with the Buckingham Palace pair is how does these little sort of objects continue to acquire meanings and values within these cross-cultural interactive spaces. All right, so I'm going to do this, I hope, reasonably briefly in two ways. I want to indicate two ways in which I think this happens. Firstly, I want to consider this pair of shell shoes in relation to the context in which they come into the possession, into royal possession, and what they sort of represent in that context. And then, more briefly, to discuss an artistic rendition of shell work in a work by Margaret Preston, which was created and exhibited around the same time. And if I can, in a sort of longer version of this paper, I really want to kind of consider the interactions or the intersections between those. One in which I'm sort of wanting to describe as a politics of motherhood on the one hand, and then a sort of politics of a national aesthetics on the other. What are the sort of interactions between that? Okay, so sort of this is shell work in Britain and in Buckingham Palace. Through archival sources, we know that shellwork made by Aboriginal women made its way mainly via missionary networks to London in the early 20th century, where it was shown and sold. Famously, an article in a London newspaper in 1910 said that pieces made by Emma Timbry from La Perouse were almost fought for. And I just wanted to slip this in because this year another little piece of shellwork has been found in the UK in a little museum in Warrington, but just a single shoe that was found in a box of sort of a whole sort of jumble of things, and Gay Sculthorpe from the British Museum sort of identified it. So I think perhaps more and more examples of pieces overseas will start to emerge. So this one is more likely to be embedded in a history, I think, of missionary exhibition. But with the pair now found in the Royal Collection, we have another example of shellwork travelling to London in the first half of the 20th century, but by a different route. This time we presume it came in the royal luggage on board the royal ship the Renown, or at least that's the speculation based on the scant documentation about it so far found. Tucked inside one of the shoes is a folded up piece of note paper bearing a fashionable London address, 145 Piccadilly, under which is written, "Made by Aborigines Victoria, Australia." The printed address, 145 Piccadilly, was the residence of the Duke and Duchess of York before they became the King and Queen in 1936, and if you're into royal history, that's because of the abdication of Edward. Anyway, while still Duke and Duchess, they toured Australia in 1927 to open the new federal parliament in Canberra, visiting every state as well as New Zealand and Fiji, and coming via Jamaica. Now, the cataloguing of a large number of gifts they received appears not to have always been accurate. Made by Aborigines Victoria, I think, is likely a mistake because, and someone might correct me about this, because I think shellwork in this style is not usually associated with or found in Victoria, but only really around La Perouse and coastal New South Wales. And I think work that needs to be done is detailed object analysis, which might in fact help us to identify its maker from among the shell workers active at La Perouse in the 1920s. So through this little piece of paper tucked inside one of the shoes, it is assumed that this shell work was given to the Duchess of York while she toured Australia. Now, what I want to sort of suggest is that the 1920s is a really, really critical decade particularly I think in Australian race relations, and a decade which is sort of a very terrible decade for Aboriginal women and their families, particularly as state intervention intensified in their lives in New South Wales as elsewhere. And many would argue that the policies and the legislation of the 1920s really did lay the foundation and apparatus for the stolen generations. Now, recent scholarship in women's history has emphasised the dominance of a discourse of maternalism in shaping women's politics, white women's politics, and a distinctive interwar feminism. But the record of Australian feminists in protecting Aboriginal women's rights as mothers, I think, is very checkered. While the interwar years were dominated by post-suffrage discourses about women's rights, focused mainly on motherhood and maternity, the politics of leading feminists and women's organisations was shot through with racial and racist thinking. Even pro-Aboriginal rights organisations in the period had trouble supporting the rights of Aboriginal women as mothers, often advocating that white women assume a guardianship role over Aboriginal children and supporting state policies of Aboriginal child removal. So what does that all have to do with a pair of shell shoes now found in Buckingham Palace? When the Duke and Duchess were on their tour, over 5 or 6 months, they left their infant daughter, the baby Princess Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth II, behind at 145 Piccadilly. Princess Elizabeth would turn 1 while her parents were in Australia. And in a convention, I think, with which we are now all familiar, and I think you can think about some media coverage in the last few weeks, the press coverage of the Duchess during the royal tour was characterised by an excessive, indeed obsessive focus on her role as a mother, and particularly on her temporary separation from her baby daughter. The lengthy but temporary separation of mother and child was an enduring theme in the British and Australian press. And it was represented visually, a story that was told over and over again about the very sad farewell to her daughter, how much she was missing her, and then ended with stories about their reuniting after 6 months. So plenty of these images of the family, the British family, coming back together. I put this one in because in any object research, you always hope to find the object somewhere, and I'm kind of hoping that it's in that glass cabinet there. But I also think her collection of dolls, including a gollywog, is kind of very telling. This is very much an image of, I think, British family and assumptions about it. So throughout the Duchess's separation from her infant, that was presented as a sacrifice, and she was routinely praised and celebrated for her stoicism. It was an occasion, it was an occasion in some ways to keep repeating a story really about universal maternal feeling, but at a time in which Aboriginal women's rights as mothers were being completely trodden over, and their own feelings about separation from children not taken into account. At the worst, it would be that they had no feelings for that separation. So I want to think about how we can place these shell objects back into this context to see the ways in which they become a kind of object of longing for children. But in the case of the monarch, it's for her own daughter. In the case of the Aboriginal producers, it's Aboriginal children more broadly, and the potential that the shell workers themselves are vulnerable to having their children taken away. So what I suppose, I'm sort of running out of time, so I'll just do a couple of rush through this a bit more quickly. So I guess in the research I've been trying to search for the occasion in which the shell work may have come into the Duchess's possession, but I've not yet found an account of when she might have received the shells, or if she had any meeting with Aboriginal women at all. So we don't know how precisely she got them, but we might assume that they didn't pass directly from the makers to her hands. While most of the gifts that she received when she was in Australia were gifts for her children, most of the people she met were women's organisations involved in maternal and infant care. So for instance, in Sydney, while her husband received an honorary doctorate from the University of Sydney, she had lunch with women's groups hosted by the National Council of Women, an organisation that Jane Carey notes had eugenicist leanings and a concern with promoting racial purity of the white nation. So I want to place these shell objects, if we know that they come from the 20s, back into this context in a way to expand the ways in which we understand them, not just as the production of commodities for new markets, but actually circulating within a cultural and political context, which allows, I think, white women like the Duchess to feel the loss of their children, but does not allow the Aboriginal makers of the objects the same kind of effective emotional feelings and range. So in more recent times, the association between shellwork and stolen children has been made more explicit. John Mundine's installation of Esma Timbre's 200 pairs of slippers at the MCA in 2019 was very clear about this. So contemporary work, I think, is drawing attention to the relationship between shellwork and stolen children, but not so much. We haven't had an opportunity to do that so much with a historic example. This historic example in the Royal Collection provides, I think, a means to think further about the connection as it played out in the 1920s. Before, I suppose, the practice of child removal became public knowledge and properly named, and in a way that implicates the British monarchy, women's organisations, the state government, under whose name these practices were made possible and permissible. All right, so that's that. If I had more time, 2 minutes, I would want to connect this also to Margaret Preston's experiments in the 1920s, which are taking up Aboriginal women's craft work, like feather flowers and shell work, and using them in a project, an experimental project of a sort of an aesthetics to sort of pursue a kind of new national art. So in the same decade that I've been describing as a decade characterised by the politics of motherhood, the Australian artist Margaret Preston had begun her experiments in using Indigenous objects and designs in her work, advocating its specific relevance to 20th century art and design. So I think in some ways these spheres overlap. So this is the famous feather flowers, and this is the 1929 image of everlasting flowers with the shell box. So in this work, it's not really my aim to interpret the artwork in art historical ways, but rather to take up some of the arguments about how to interpret Preston's practice of using Aboriginal women's craft work within her paintings. Various scholars have pointed out that Preston's fervent advocacy of Aboriginal design as a source of inspiration for white Australian artists was redolent of the neo-colonialism of the time, which valued objects for being authentic, tribal and uncorrupted by contact. Shell work, like feather flowers, defied those narrow notions of authenticity as a practice that was taken up by Aboriginal women via Victorian women's arts and crafts. But Anne Stevens suggests that Preston overlooked the question of authenticity as these Aboriginal-made craft objects served other aesthetic purposes, particularly sort of the mechanics of making one natural form look like another, that is, shells and feathers made to look like flowers. She was interested in that process, and the juxtaposition of the flowers and the shellwork box draws attention to that. So as Deborah Edwards writes, its presence suggests that Preston recognised in instances of contemporary cultural exchange which shellwork represented, a practice which embodied her own aims for a handcrafted composite expressing the simplified forms of modernity in a synthetic Aboriginal Western form. So I guess bringing these two together, the sense is what are the implications for the Aboriginal producers of these objects? How do these two, I think, white women's projects through which Aboriginal women's shellwork circulate, what do they have to say really about the realities and the experience of Aboriginal women's lives and the places and sites in which this work is produced? So I've got 1 minute, I know, to bring this together. My overarching question is really about what kinds of mediation might we understand the little shoes in the Royal Collection and the example in the Preston's painting do. What do they mediate and what might they mediate now? And what I've been trying to suggest, not very effectively, is that I think they've been taken up for this project in ways that can both eclipse and actually deny knowledge of the lives of their makers. For ideas of motherhood or modernism, two spheres to some extent from which Aboriginal women are excluded. Now, I think shellwork remains kind of vulnerable to this, and I want to just go back to this article in the Women's Weekly, in which it's the little object's already being translated, it's been taken up in this popular press, and it's saying already that the little shoes were made for Princess Elizabeth when she was a baby and presented to the Duchess of York by Indigenous Australian women in Victoria when Her Royal Highness toured in 1927. So here I think is another political project getting ready to make a new king, in which it's possible to say, here are some objects which were given to us by Aboriginal women, suggesting a relationship which was actually closer, more personal, and in a way, again, denying the social, cultural, political discourses and contexts in which these objects were actually made, and by which means they passed into royal possession. So I might just leave it there. Sorry, it's been a bit garbage.